Hi, this is Jose Palomino with another episode of the Revenue Throughput Podcast. And our guest today is Jeffrey Slater of themarketingsage.com. And Jeffrey is certainly that. He's been a CMO of some big companies. He's worked with a lot of small and mid-sized companies. And he is the Chief Listening Officer, and he'll explain what that means. So listen to this episode and learn from the marketing sage, Jeffrey Slater. Welcome, Jeff, to the Revenue Throughput Podcast.
Thanks, Jose. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, Jeff, one thing that's always helpful to our listeners, because we have so many interesting guests, and I include you in that, is to really get a sense of you. Just tell us, who do you work with and what do you primarily do for them? High level, we'll dig in from there.
Well, my title is Chief Listening Officer for my marketing consultancy business, which is the Marketing Sage. And the word sage is means wisdom through experience. And so for the last 40 years, I've been focused on marketing. And at the root of everything that I do is really the ability to listen and ask questions and get clarity to understand in advance of giving people advice. So I focus very much on being the chief listening officer in every one of my engagements because I need to understand and to probe to make sure I get clarity from a client or a stakeholder I'm interviewing to deeply understand what they truly mean. Sometimes beyond the transactional nature of what they're saying, trying to understand at a more emotional level what they mean by the words they're using.
So let's dig into that a little bit. And just to further supply context, so are these typically companies that would be like owner-led, like many of our listeners on this podcast, or would they be big corporations or somewhere in between?
It's a mix. So there are startups that I consult with. There are owner-operator companies that I consult with. There's small to mid-sized companies. So I like to say that I love going into organizations where there isn't anybody or there are just a few people who are in marketing or focused around marketing issues. I think that's where I can bring the most value.
Okay. Yeah, because sometimes if you go into too big an organization, it's not like you couldn't, and I know your background, you've worked in large companies, you've had great success in major corporate marketing, but there's a lot of stakeholders that have their own opinions, and it's hard to get them all on the same page. But when you work with a smaller company, and by that, it could be a startup, but it could be a mid-sized company, there's I would think, a greater receptivity. Finally, somebody who can bring some clarity here, and you're not necessarily having to throw elbows to get heard, because they want you there at that point.
Right. I think that's one of the things that I have always excelled at is taking something complicated, making it simpler, putting an emphasis on focus, and being mindful of the fact that you have to be both structured and flexible at the same time. There's this polarity of thinking where you have to be able to do both of those things. It's like breathing. You have to breathe in and you have to breathe out. It's not either or. You breathe only by doing both.
Right.
And so I think that's a big piece. And then to the point of the clients I serve, I've had $30 budgets for marketing, and I've had $30 million budgets for marketing. And understanding how and when and where to apply spending to leverage a message, a communication, a story is a critical part of the work that I do each day.
Well, so let's dig into that a little bit here, Jeff. So when you first again, you start engaged. So somebody thinks there's something not going well with their marketing or something. Presumably they learned about you, they decide to talk to you. How often do you think that they think, we got this thing figured out? What we need is a new website. We need some help with our SEO. We need some new collateral for our salesperson. When can you have that done for us? And I can't imagine you don't have some that start that way. And then I know from talking to you that you say, well, hold on a second. You have to kind of pump the brakes on that for a little bit. We got to take a look at a bigger picture. How do you navigate, or how do you help an owner see that they have to pause, even though they're dying to get moving and they're ready. They say, I got budget, I'm ready to spend money on these things. What's the value to them for slowing down?
So I like to ask the question, if we work together and it's a year from now, how will you measure success? What are the metrics that will help you to say, this was a good investment of my time and resources to work with the marketing stage? Why is that? And so very often what I get into is, well, we'll grow sales. Okay, well, tell me what that means specifically. How have you been growing over the last 2 years? What's the rate of growth? Is that growth value growth where you're not just growing, but it's profitable growth? And so it's, to me, it's very much the peeling back of an onion and the layers to get to the core of understanding. And sometimes people will say to me, well, we want to grow by 10% year over year. I say, okay, so tell me about your demand generation overall. How do you generate leads and qualify them? Do you have a predictable revenue process? Explain that to me so I understand it. Who's responsible for it? How do you review it? How do you monitor it? How do you measure it? And what I'll find is much of the time it's back of the envelope. It's not structured because they don't want it to be overly detailed and process oriented. Yet that may be a root cause of the challenge that they're facing, is they're not doing things on a regular and consistent basis. And I think I find that very often to be a problem, particularly with businesses that are a bit stagnated in their growth or their profitability, or who are facing competitive challenges from places they never anticipated, from people outside their category who are selling because their product or service is a substitution for what they offer.
Right. So substitutions often just they get blindsided by the fact that there's an alternative. So I'm selling bookkeeping services, not realizing my real alternative from my client's perspective is QuickBooks. To make a very simple example.
Exactly. No, that's an exact point. And so, I think having a clear understanding of that is important. And I use the metaphor all the time, but I think it's incredibly valuable because I worked in the wine industry for so long, and just in an agricultural business, of course, it's very relevant. Marketing is about planting seeds. It's about nurturing. It's about fertilizing. It's about watering. It's about pruning and caring. And then slowly you get these green shoots, and eventually things grow, and there's a chance to harvest the fruit of that plant or the flower of that plant. And that's sales. And so those two things have to work together hand in hand. They have to be aligned. There has to be clarity of purpose. There has to be clarity of role. But they're not at odds with each other. They have to be aligned with each other. And so, one of the things, one of the mistakes I see a lot of marketing people making is they aren't close enough to the customer. You get salespeople out in the field who are at the front line and close to customers. Marketing people have to be locked arms in front of those same people to be listening, to hear and understand the challenges that they face, and to see and understand it so that they can find solutions together.
But now, one thing I've seen, especially in the kind of size category companies we're talking about, especially in B2B, more so than B2C, where they know they have to have a customer, they may be a little bit more sophisticated in pure marketing. But in B2B, they may have like a young, 2 years out of college marketing coordinator posting on social every day. And then that's the answer. How do you help that owner see that, that's good. It's good that you're doing something there, but that may not be the right thing to do. Do you ever get resistance from an owner thinking that, no, we're doing the right things, but yet they're talking to you?
I tend to be very counterintuitive about things with people because, you know, um, Not that I think social media has its place in the marketing mix, but I like to dig deeper and say, tell me about the new business that you've acquired in the last 2 years, and specifically where they came from. How did you get those leads? What was the reason that they came to you? What problem does your product or service solve for them? And why would they speak to you? And oftentimes there's a shrugging of shoulders, or they're not sure and they don't track it. They're not quite clear. It comes in over the transom. It comes from, and without it being clear, how can you create predictability into the future? So, I worked with a client several years ago, and when I interviewed all the stakeholders internally, and I asked them to tell me what problems they solve for people. I had a list of, I don't know, 40, 50 different things. And then they all said the same thing at the end of those conversations. Our customers don't know this. But we do these things, but they don't know it. So, my audit and analysis to the CEO was, you need a regular and consistent way to tell these stories, not in a transactional way of, here are the features of our product, but here's a story of a guy named Jose who has this problem, who is trying to solve this situation. And along came product X or service Y. And through working together, we were able to get him this outcome. So leveraging storytelling and connecting to the emotional benefit of value that you're delivering. Not, sales is an irrational, people buy irrationally. There's not a clear, and there's no better industry to look at that than the wine industry in terms of assumptions and expectations of value as it relates to and directly connected to price. And there's untold examples of brands and products. I think BMW, when they first entered the United States, just had no luck selling for 5 years. And then they decided to triple their pricing, triple it, because people would say, well, how could this be the ultimate driving machine if it was the same as X and Y in these economy levels? And when they were suddenly 3 times the price, people said, well, they must be that good if they get that price. So the perception of value is a critical piece in all of this.
Now, when you get into some of these things, and again, I'm not only interested in the B2B category, but it's interesting to me, especially in industrial categories. Things like perception, branding, the aesthetic of a company. Some of these are very old line industrial, like we make valves or we make a machine. How do you help, or what would you tell an owner in terms of the need to have some commitment to branding, aesthetic, messaging? That it's not just like, hey, they know our valves. We've been in business for 98 years, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
How do,
I
how do
think
you?
part of it is myth busting and
Okay.
finding a way to communicate and manage. I call it perception management. And I'll give you a specific example of something that I did in the wine industry, the wine packaging industry.
Mm-hmm.
So the company that I worked for closed 1 out of every 8 bottles of wine in the world with a synthetic cork made of plastic. Now, plastic had a negative perception, and we had great relationships with the technical people in the wine industry, but very little in the way of relationships with the marketing people. So what we did was we created a conference in the US in the Napa area, where within an hour and a half are most of the wine marketing professionals. And we created an event called the Wine Marketing Exchange. It was non-commercial. We attracted fantastic speakers and interesting people from outside the industry, people in consumer packaged goods, but who weren't necessarily wine marketing speakers. They were people from, companies like Method and IDEO and LinkedIn and just a range of different companies, really fascinating speakers, cultural anthropologists. And we were able to attract 75 people who were key marketing professionals in the wine industry to listen to and engage with us. And we spent half the day with this conference and then half the day with wine tastings and then dinner afterwards. And so we got to spend time and build relationships with these people who were influencers, but not necessarily final decision makers, although in some cases they were. And then we took this idea to Europe and we did it in France and Italy and other markets. And the point of it was we wanted to shift perception from plastic to human being. Jeff, Katie, Yolanda, Mark, all the different people Don, all the people who worked in the business and who were at the front lines, Jay. Suddenly the face of our company became us as individuals and our relationship, and we were bringing value to them without trying to sell them. And it had a meaningful impact on our business overall over time.
Well, it also sounds like a tough gig, but somebody had to do it, right?
It was probably one of the most fun things that I've ever done in my career. And I have had some unbelievable experiences. I think I mentioned to you, I worked for a company that owned the Slim Jim brand, and I got to work with Macho Man Randy Savage for many, many years.
Wow.
Doing commercials and publicity for us. And then my wife and I worked with Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield from Ben and Jerry's to make a Rachel's Brownies ice cream, was the name of our bakery business. And we even got to meet and had lunch with President Reagan when he spoke at the Great Valley Corporate Center in Malvern, Pennsylvania in 1985. And my wife was sitting on the dais as one of the business owners in this park. And that was a wild and crazy experience. And I've got these stories on my blog about all those events, and they're hilarious stories that I just love to share and tell. Well, and I write quite a lot of, probably written about 1,400 blog posts, just giving away ideas and advice on marketing at the marketing stage.
Yeah, no doubt, Jeff. And, clearly you've done so many very interesting things. And I like the way you've gone about making it possible for companies that maybe could not have afforded you as a full-time, CMO at a large company. So that raises this question, and I teach a course at Villanova on entrepreneurial marketing, where I start with this one question: what's the difference between entrepreneurial marketing and marketing? Like, why not just use the same word? And they give me all kinds of suggested answers, and I said, well, entrepreneurial marketing is when you're marketing with $30. That's, you have to be more clever than just spend money. So how do you process maybe your life lessons, which are deep and wide, into smaller organizations that don't have those aren't going to do the Napa, conference for 75 businesses? Because even just that event alone could be their entire 2-year annual budget that they're spending on marketing. Sure. So how do you translate those principles so they're right sized for a smaller company?
Well, I think it's really all comes down to one word, and that is empathy. I look at it as, what would I do if this were my money? And I will not recommend something to somebody unless I've convinced myself that I would spend the money out of my own pocket to do that. Because as an entrepreneur, having run, a commercial photography business and then a wholesale bakery business and a consulting business, I know what it's like to have to pull those dollars out of your pocket and invest. And so I really start with convincing myself first that it's the right thing. And I want to try and test it in some small way to gain confidence that I believe in it even more. And I can prove with some kind of data set that it's of value.
And these days, testing small tests with small budgets is a lot easier than it's ever been in the history of ever.
Absolutely. There are so many ways you can take a strategy and then parse it out into a couple months of trial and test and learn and say, how will we know this is successful? What would it look like? How do we set the right expectations?
Wow. Well, Jeff, we're about out of time here right now, but this has been great. I love your stories and I love the insights on, and I love the idea of empathy. And that applies not only to you as a practitioner helping your clients, but also perhaps what they should practice in terms of knowing what their customers need as well. So I'm assuming that's like a through line in how you do things. You're the chief listening officer after all. So, if somebody listening to this podcast wanted to know more about you and your work, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
Sure. Everything is at my website, themarketingsage.com. And you can connect with me there. All my contact information. You can text me or email me or call me, and we can start a conversation. And when you call, I'll be listening.
Excellent. Excellent, Jeff. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Jose. I appreciate it.